Yes, we are back again. Back again on a Thursday, Thinking Link Pants Optional, where we leave it up to you. And we have two wonderful guests, Mehdi and our friend Glenn. We're going to talk about healthcare and all related things today at Thinking Link. As you might know, this is sponsored by Capsule. Capsule.us is a firm here in Minneapolis, and we are considered a special projects firm. And so we do all kinds of things, from helping people invent new things to helping people reinvent brands, refresh brands, and a variety of other things you can find at Capsule.us, which our omnipotent one, Thomas, just put out there on the chat. Which is also where we have you put your questions. We ask everyone to be on mute. You can have your video on. We love to see faces, but on mute as far as audio, so we don't have too much going on, right, Kelly? Put your questions out there as we get into this discussion. I'm going to do something a little bit different this week, and that I'm going to do my best to introduce these two gentlemen. Usually we have our guests introduce themselves. This was sparked a little bit by, they have such fascinating and different backgrounds, but yet they've intersected as human beings, and they found each other very fascinating as they wanted to appear on this platform to do that, which is, of course, also very fascinating because we're always amazed that people will show up here. I'm going to do a quick introduction of each of them, and then Kelly's going to start off with one of our questions. Does that sound good to you, Kelly?
Sounds fantastic, Aaron. Yes.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, I'm going to start with Mehdi because, well, he was born on a totally different continent. He was born, went to elementary school in Iran, and middle school in the United States, which is always interesting to call it middle school, and then completed high school and university in Australia. So that would be 3 different continents in his schooling, which is a really fascinating perspective. And then he spent a fair amount of time at Ziba, which is a firm that I respect profoundly. They are an industrial design firm out of Portland, which is probably the reason we intersected at some point in time, because we were at a conference. And now he's currently the CMO at Moda Health, and his entire background is rather fascinating to me as far as where he's been and how he's gotten here, and as he talks about creativity and innovation in health and healthcare. And then Glenn was also born on another continent, born in Wales, and started working at the tender age of 16, which I think he got labor laws against that, but whatever. He went let's see, graduate school and postgraduate. He's also spent time on, it looks like, almost every single continent. His most recent gig was the Global Chief Marketing Officer at GE Healthcare, which is gargantuan by any measures, 20 billion in revenue. And so he's got also a lot of different perspectives to bring to bear in this conversation. Hopefully I've done them well. If they have anything else to add, because of course that was very freestyle on my form, to their background and perspective. Those are our two guests. We are talking healthcare, and as you all know, kind of the center of the storm, or the center of the energy of everything that's going on around COVID and this pandemic. So this is going to be a fascinating discussion. Be sure to have your chat open for your questions as we go. Kelly, I'll let you take it away with the first question.
Great, Glenn, Mehdi, really very glad to have you this morning. And yes, I'd love to just jump right in with a broad overview, your perspectives on what's happening in the healthcare sector during this pandemic. So Glenn, we'd had some previous conversations from the tech solution side, and then Mehdi in terms of programming, and we'll get into more of the detail around the tech there. But can you give us just a broad overview of what you're seeing? And then a second question to that is, what healthcare sectors are really struggling right now? Who wants to start?
Yeah, I can kick off. Mehdi, shall I kick off and you jump?
Please, of course.
Oh, thanks for the question. And it's good to get grounded on what's going on here. I I think the first thing, to think about here is that when we say healthcare, it's actually quite a complicated ecosystem, right? It's not as simple as the first thing that you may think of, which is your local healthcare provider. It's a complex ecosystem made up of the providers themselves, the payers, obviously the insurers, and in many parts of the world, the government who actually pay for that kind of stuff. The vendors who provide the technology, be it IT technology or device technology. There's the pharmaceutical industry, be it on the drug development and research side or the pharma side and so forth. And so it's a complex but very connected ecosystem. And all of them obviously impact each other, but in a virus pandemic situation like this, in a recessionary environment that we're entering into, each of them are affected in let's say, slightly different ways, but with knock-on effects that come on. And so what I kind of see in headline perspective is that obviously, in terms of, let's say, how these brands are performing in the marketplace, let's say call it the stock markets or whatever, in aggregate, they're doing better than most other sectors, right? When I look at the financial services crisis years ago compared to this crisis, the healthcare brands are all moving up and everything else is moving down. Back in the financial crisis, it was, everything else moving up and the financial stuff and other discretionary spend going down. So there's a lot more interest and investment in healthcare. But it is hiding some subtleties. What we've all heard is, for example, on the provider side, that the virus is basically everyone's firefighting it. And so a lot of the revenue streams that hospital gets around discretionary procedures just simply have really radically dropped off. And so revenue streams are being impacted there. Tech providers scrambled to provide the technology like ventilators and other things to help the virus, fight the virus, but most other technology provision dropped off completely. On the IT side, you saw a surge towards telemedicine and things like that. Other things dropped off completely. And obviously on the pharmaceutical side, you saw kind of, big race to get to the vaccine and the research there, de-emphasis on other things. And so you saw kind of different players doing well in different areas. And at the moment, everyone's kind of fighting their way through this and doing okay as a result of that. But the reality is that when you think about post-virus, there's going to be quite a lot of distress in the system. As people are investing less, have less money to pay, are trying to recover from the fact that you've got discretionary services that just need significant catch up. You think about people who've put off treatments and, who are going to be presenting at the ER and presenting at places with quite extreme conditions. There's going to be a lot of stress on the systems after that. So it's going to be a bit of an interesting kind of movie that we go through. I mean, Mehdi, you're front and center on the provider side. What have you been seeing in terms of the evolution here?
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. As Glenn explained, it's a very complex and fragmented ecosystem, and the healthcare has been going through change prior to the pandemic. And I think in many ways, there's the challenges are only amplified. I think, Moda Health is more both on the health insurance side and some of the care side of the business. And I think if you think about the economic drivers of healthcare, I call them the two key factors. One is the coverage, the insurance, the revenue side, and the other is utilization, right? How people use the care, and that drives the utilization, drives technology and many other things from the medical equipment. As we think about the coverage side, the only thing we've seen is more of a shift from one line of product to another. Obviously with more unemployment, people are more on Medicaid, right? So it's just been a shift in terms of the lines of business. What we did see is the significant decline initially on the utilization side, particularly in hospitals, but also more so to some of the other specialists, especially like dentists. I mean, for a long time, they couldn't even practice. So they were the ones that really struggled. I think what we're seeing is it's coming back, and the level of utilization is significantly increased over the last 2 or 3 months. It's still not at the same level as pre-pandemic, but it is increasing. I mean, dentists are practicing now, so that is a good news through that lens. But as I think as Glenn mentioned, I think what's going to be more important is what's going to happen post-COVID, and in terms of where do we go from here. I think, healthcare by its nature is driven a lot by policy, and it'll be interesting to see what changes occur through the policy. And the impact of policy, it goes, in so many ways. It impacts the coverage, impacts utilization, and so forth. So we got elections coming up, which potentially can impact policy changes. And then we have COVID going on. And then we have the whole industry going through a lot of different changes. Consolidation is one big factor that's happening. Integration between healthcare, from the insurance to providers to even retail, what you've seen with CVS and so forth. And then we have technology shifts that are happening as well, and social changes. We've seen a greater move to local and home care, for example. We've seen changes in terms of telehealth and so forth that we can get into. So there's a lot going on. Not all bad. I think some of it is actually going to be positive as we think about post-COVID.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Ben.
Answer.
Yes.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Glenn, what advice are you giving to CEOs as you're out there consulting and advising, or maybe at the beginning of this pandemic, if that's changed to now, as far as their spending on marketing, advertising, brand building efforts? What are you putting out? What do you think brands should be doing?
I think it's clearly the first thing is it's grounded in a couple of things. One is the current pandemic situation and what the movie is going to look like kind of as you go out. And there are some things that are true in any kind of stress situation, and some things that you need to put in place specifically for this kind of dynamic. I mean, let's face it, right? For people who are marketers on the phone, they know that on the call, they know that marketing is usually one of the first cost line items that the CFO goes to in a cost out situation. And as we're going into a recessionary environment, all the forecasts are pretty negative across most areas, not all. There are some really bright spots in different areas, but generally speaking, in healthcare, you're seeing tech vendors who are going to be under price pressure. You're going to see providers under price pressure and cost pressures. And so when you have revenue pressure, there's cost pressure, and marketing is often the first on the list. However, I'd say there's a couple of things. First of all, marketers do need to step up. So when I'm talking to CEOs, I think, the question is that they need to look to their marketers to step up and play that part in the cost actions, but not in a dumb way, right? There's always an opportunity, particularly in a stress environment like this, to take a fresh perspective on the way that marketing and commercial teams are executing together. And say, okay, so what's been working in the past isn't necessarily the way you want to do things today. How do you start to bring greater vitality and agility into the way that people work? How do you more tightly couple marketing and sales engines together? And how do you actually look at taking a completely fresh look at the way that you're structured? Because sometimes it's the way that you were executing marketing before in particular ways, particular silos, just doesn't work in a new world, and it's a fresh thing to do. So I've encouraged CMOs and CEOs to say, cut if you need to cut, but don't just cut, restructure, and restructure with a fresh perspective on what the world is going to look like. The second thing I'd be saying is that, look, your marketing team's never been more important when it comes to customer market insight, and coupling that insight through to business model innovation and to how you think about the way that you should be structuring your portfolio. So you're going to be coming into price pressures situations, right? So do you have the right portfolio, the right value offerings for it? Do you have the right value proposition for that environment? You're coming into a situation where what you were selling before may not be what you're going to be selling in the future. Mm-hmm. You're going to be coming into a situation where many of your customers are capital constrained. So do you have more operating cost models that you should be moving into? And so it's really a case of what have you got in terms of the right listening and customer engagement strategies? How can you use that to translate your business model and your portfolios? And then last couple of thoughts I'd have is in these environments, trust matters, right? Brand and trust and credibility matters. They matter more than anything. And when you're insecure about your future, you look for brands that you trust. And when you're in a cost controlled or when you're counting every pennies, you're thoughtful about where you put your money. And so investing in brand at times may feel like an unmeasured thing to a lot of companies, but it could not be more important than it is today. If you're not investing in your brand, establishing that trust, that brand affinity, perceived value of your offerings, then you are not going to maximize the opportunities that kind of come out of this turmoil today. So all the people who are cutting back on brand work, I would say that's probably a fatal error here.
Yeah.
And lastly, I'd say all the evidence shows that in stress situations, the companies that invest in innovation do better. So if people are going to constrain their R&D, that's a big mistake. Pumping energy into creativity and innovation is going to also be a hallmark for success. So a bit of a shopping list there, but marketing restructure, really take a good look at the cost structure and change things, invest in brand, invest in innovation, invest in agility and vitality and diversity in your systems.
God, that's
That's
a
great.
great answer. Yeah, that was really good. I want to use that as an endorsement campaign for Capsule. Please. I have one quick thing to insert into that was such a profoundly intellectual and beautiful answer to that question. The thing that I've been talking about is the NASCAR metaphor, which is if you consider a recession, an accident on the road in NASCAR, typically the recommendation for NASCAR drivers is accelerate through, right? Do not try to slow down, right? Accelerate through the accident, which would fit the spend on brand if you can, especially in these times when there's concern and worry and they need trust. Mehdi, I'd love your perspective on the same question.
Yeah, I love this question because this is one of the reasons I got into healthcare, because I saw the opportunity. And my biggest recommendation is, and it's been the same, embrace change. Healthcare consumers' expectations from brands are formed by the experience with other brands outside the industry. And healthcare needs to catch up. It's been behind as it pertains to many factors in terms of customer experience and brands. So we really need to, what I would say is also change your perspective of what marketing is, because I think for many organizations, healthcare, in terms of tenure of leadership, it's quite long. So a lot of people grew up with marketing from a different perspective to what truly marketing is about today and what it means to the business. It's not just about the great campaign any longer. It's really about helping the growth of the business. So embrace change, lead by a greater purpose as an organization, find what your purpose is, define your unique value proposition. Healthcare is entering a lot more in the world of consumerism, right? And there's a greater need to be able to define what makes you unique and different. As Glenn said, you got to build trust through your brand, but more so through your actions and delivering on your promise, and not just your sentiments. Focus on member and patient experience. There's a significant correlation, especially in healthcare, between customer experience and customer loyalty. You really have to invest in patient and member experience. Embrace digital transformation. For a lot of providers, you still see fax machines. I mean, really, right? So we've got to embrace digital transformation throughout the organization. I think, as Glenn said, you need to have dedicated efforts towards true innovation, right? It can't be just, yeah, we're innovative. No, you really have to have an innovation strategy for the organization. And then use the power of data. I mean, healthcare in particular, in terms of healthcare outcomes, can be so impacted by data and insights. So there's a lot there. but they all encompass the notion of embrace change, embrace marketing, not as from a, as I said, from storytelling only, but really about building brand and also building experience and driving innovation.
Hey, Mehdi, you dropped in the middle there, just excellent reflection there, the whole digital stuff, right? And we've clearly seen digital accelerate across every industry, but particularly healthcare, right? During this pandemic. And I was amused by your comment about faxes. Yeah, you see them everywhere. Did you know that the NHS I read somewhere, the National Health Service in the UK is the single global largest purchaser of fax machines on the planet, and still is. What are you seeing? What are you seeing on the digital acceleration side, from your perspective, on particularly from a provider side? What are you seeing happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think digital. We're certainly seeing it more from a virtual care has been significant. I mean, the take up in telehealth, even teledentistry, telebehavioral services. So that's an area that we've seen a significant adoption. But in the other areas, less so. And I think there's so much opportunity in terms of infusing digital. And I think often digital is only seen through the lens of just, experience, but I'm talking about digital throughout the organization as it pertains to operational excellence, because in many ways, the operation and the experience are connected today, right? So you can no longer just say, I have a great, website. Well, how does the website connect to the operations side of the business, right? So to me, when I'm thinking about digital transformation, it's thinking more about the organization. Often asked, people think about digital strategy and they think about more from a customer side of things. Whereas to me, digital transformation really embraces digital as a movement within an organization. And I think the benefits of it are going to be significant, both in terms of, as I said, efficiency, in terms of growth, and in healthcare, efficiency is a big factor, as we all know. So it could really impact the overall business. I think the challenge, to be honest with you, is that because healthcare is so fragmented, and we know technology and transformation requires investment, it is hard for many of them to see that return, right? If you're a small hospital trying to install huge changes in transformation in terms of technology is significant and sometimes cost prohibitive. So, but the reality is that is the future. You either have to embrace it or you're not going to be in business, I believe.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it, with the telemedicine thing, that so much of that growth was enabled by COVID-enforced changes to regulation and reimbursement. So right. In the US anyway, different stories around the world, but it took a pandemic for the government to put in place what really should have been sensible measures right from the get-go to enable digitization of delivery of healthcare.
But I also think that there's the technology side of it, but there's also the consumer adoption of it, right? It forced people to realize, oh, this actually works. I think in the same way people realize the benefits of delivery by Amazon and so forth for their groceries, right? Sometimes you have to experience it to overcome that barrier. And once you do, then you go, oh, okay, this is not so bad. I can keep using it, right? So there's the adoption side of it, and then there's sort of the actual technology bringing it to the people. Telehealth has been around for a number of years, but adoption was very low, very low. So, sometimes when consumers are forced to experience something new, there's a hesitation. Once you do it, you'll never go back.
Yeah, it's a great point, and we'll let the Capsule guys ask questions in a second, but you and I...
Yeah, this is great. Keep going, please.
It's kind of fascinating, because exactly to that, even like when you look at e-commerce, right, there's something like, I saw data that says something like 10 or 15% of the volume was coming from people who'd never purchased on e-commerce before, but of course they're forced to, right? They're stuck in their homes with the pandemic. They were or their local businesses were shut and only did e-commerce or pickups and things like that. So they were forced to, and of course, as you say, found hopefully a good experience, and many of them will never go back again. One of the things that I found fascinating, particularly, my background is very much B2B, right? I spent some time in B2C, but mostly I'm a B2B guy. And one of the areas that has always been I've talked about this a lot in different forums, a real kind of digital holdout is B2B selling, right? So salespeople in business to business context, still hung on to a model of the permanent road warrior, and needing to be in the room, the power of their Rolodex, all of that kind of stuff. And when you're a B2B marketer, there's for the most part a salesperson between you and the customer relationship at the end, and that's a tremendous asset, right? Having an individual selling and engaging with your value proposition to a customer is just fantastic, but it's expensive and it's hard to scale. And so this pandemic has kind of busted some myths, I think, in terms of how much of B2B selling you can truly do digitally, and even demonstrating physical product in virtual environments is gaining a significantly more traction than it ever did. So I think for me that's fascinating. Is and this is another kind of conversation I have with CEOs right now, is what can you do to consolidate that gain, right? What can you do to permanently shift the B2B selling model so that you're really capitalizing on those digital gains and optimizing your sales force and optimizing the customer experience across omni-channel with more digital enablement?
Yeah, it's interesting.
Fantastic.
Kelly?
Yes, I'm going to shift gears. This is in the same vein, but Mehdi, turn this question to you. You speak obviously regularly from the Moda Health perspective, the focus on building healthy communities, and I've seen some articles and interviews where you've spoken about the primary challenges within the healthcare ecosystem with regard to affordability, access, and then ultimately consumer empowerment. Can you speak a little bit about what you're seeing that's maybe now different during the pandemic, and then how some of this innovation and adoption of these innovative digital care services are helping address these challenges?
Yeah, I mean, the notion of building healthier communities is really part of our brand ethos. And that's something that the organization truly cares about. And so for us in terms of our brand, is really trying to deliver on that purpose of building healthier communities. Mm-hmm. And we do that as an organization in many ways. Obviously, education is a big part of healthcare, right? In terms of people a lot of times don't have enough knowledge about healthcare, let alone insurance, or about the types of treatments. So how can we bring information to the communities? And then how do we partner with providers to really help the different sectors? In the context, when you think about people in the healthcare, there are people that are healthy, and then there are people that are chronically ill, and those that are chronic drive, the 5% drive 50% of the cost in the healthcare business, mm-hmm. right? So how can we partner with providers to really help those people in terms of helping them get better sooner? And then there's people in between, right? And so that's what makes really healthcare interesting. As an organization, we find one of the best ways we can do that is not just focusing on from an insurance perspective, but also the different types of care. We focus on dental, we focus on pharmacy, we focus on obviously the medical side of things, and all of these things are connected, right? Your oral health is connected to your overall health, right? So how can dental play a bigger part in your overall health? The pharmacy, the medication side obviously plays a big part. So what makes, as I said, healthcare really interesting is this sort of the complexity of it. And as an organization, if you can break through that complexity and really focus on the individuals and their needs and the different ways you can do that, I think is what helps people get better and ultimately drive a healthier community.
Thank you.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's there's this continuum of care kind of concept, isn't there? That's emerging and being enabled by digital and by pharmaceutical advances and so forth, which is this connection between this concept of population health through to precision medicine. You know, where therapeutics are being more and more targeted to individual disease states and so forth. Yeah, you know, you talked a bit about what you do, what's going on, and the focus around communities and population health there a lot, right? And is there a connection in your institution through to personalized medicine as well, or is that something that's still kind of being worked on?
Yeah, I think you know, we're obviously a provider in terms of hospital system, but data is playing such an important role in terms of really understanding that population health aspect of it. One of the biggest factors in that's connected to people's health is their zip code, right? That's the number one correlation between your zip code and your health. So when I talk about community health, is really understanding how do we shift those, but also understand, you know, those factors that are influencing people, because not being able to go to a doctor can help, you know, can impact people's health when they do go to a doctor, because at that time, you know, they have a lot more conditions, right? So how do we leverage data? How do we leverage insights that we already know about these people? And then how do we leverage that and combine that with what the hospitals know about them to collaborate together to help those individuals? So I think the key thing is about data, it's about insights, but it's also the collaboration. And that's why you're seeing a great shift in the healthcare from fee-for-service to what we call value-based. So fee-for-service, you're paying for, you know, you go to the doctors, you pay for it. Whereas, and therefore the contracts between the insurance and the providers are based on that fee. Whereas now we're talking about value, right? It's about outcomes. How are we shifting the health of those populations? And the benefits of those is only when we realize the greater outcomes, right? So that collaboration, I think, is so critical to the future of healthcare between the providers and the payers or the insurance companies, in really helping improve the quality, the standards, and ultimately, as I said, the level of health outcomes.
Yeah, you just I couldn't agree more. You know, it's interesting, isn't it, that you've made reference a few times to the fragmentation, and that fragmentation is somewhat the enemy of value-based care, right? Because it's hard to have an outcome-based situation. You've got so many fragmented players in, and there's at the risk of scaring people and getting you to you know, rioting in the streets and writing to your senator. You know, when you look at things like reimbursement rates, right, for things. If you were to go for a CT scan, right, in the US, then typically the kind of the reimbursement rates, you know, what an insurance company would pay a healthcare provider to execute that scan, would depend on the scan itself in the details, but it's in the order of thousands of dollars, right? You know, it's like a couple of $1,000s for a CT scan. You know, have a, you know, at the risk of putting anyone on the spot, Mehdi may know because he comes from Iran, so I'm not going to ask him. So Kelly or Aaron, you know, what do you think the reimbursement rate for the same procedure would be in a country in Europe, would you say?
Wow.
For exactly the same procedure in a national health system, which is inherently a value-based, outcome-based system, because it's funded by the government, right? So what do you think a reimbursement rate, $2,000 US for a CT scan, what do you think it would be in I don't know, Turkey, let's say?
$1,000? I'm going to put a guess out there.
$200. $200.
Wow.
So Glenn, I experienced this. I lived in Vienna, Austria, and my healthcare costs there versus US, similar procedures, giving birth, completely different experience.
Yeah.
So to that point, I understand it. Yes.
So you know, and I see on the group chat, one of the people listening in is referencing in India, it's kind of like 150. You know, and you'll see some variation from country to country, but the point is it's an order of magnitude, you know, 10 times difference in terms of cost. And that's because, to Mehdi's point, you have a fragmented system that's based on transactions versus a value-based system delivering outcomes. And so when you're not having someone who's looking at the overall end-to-end value that's being created, people are just driving for value in individual situations there. And it's very, very hard when you're in that movie to drive cost out of systems, unless you're looking at the end.
Yeah, one of my thoughts always about healthcare, and because I've lived in, as Aaron said, in different countries, I have experienced different healthcare, is in the US, we are trying to deliver 5-star Ritz-Carlton experience in terms of hospitals to every person, whether they can afford it or not. And I think in other countries, you see different levels of care in the same way you might see different levels of hotels, right? The quality or efficacy is all good. And sometimes it's not a reflection that just because you go to a 3-star, you're going to get a 3-star treatment. It's that you may have to share a room, for example, right? In many of those countries, you share with multiple people. So it's not about the efficacy of the treatment, it's the overall cost, and whether you want a private room, whether you want to have this suite. Whereas in the US, you don't have those choices, right? Whether you like it or not, you're going to get this beautiful room with 3 monitors in it, and et cetera. And all those things are adding to the cost that, you know, Glenn talked about, ultimately leads to more expensive treatment. So there's very little segmentation in terms of different levels of healthcare delivery that people can perhaps afford, or those that really want to have, you know, the best. So I think that's an opportunity.
Absolutely.
It's such a fascinating design question. You know, looking at healthcare and looking at the complexity of it, and as we talk about it as an ecosystem, and that there isn't one solve, but there are things like, you know, we don't see the cost of our healthcare. The fact that you could ask that question and that we didn't know, and actually, if you'd asked the question, how much was it, I would have no idea, right? And then to ask what it is everywhere else, right? Yeah, but I could tell you the price of a Big Mac, which is probably wrong. Those two things, you know, out there in the world. So is it because we don't know the cost of our healthcare? We're not just, you know, we're not accountable for it in some ways. That's causing it.
It's as anything, right? You know, it's complex, and I was being deliberately simple about some of the issues there, because often it's a case of you have, for example, service providers who might do the scan. They may charge one thing. They may be subcontracted to a hospital who may add margin on top of that, and therefore you see something else. So you also have situations where you have certain health systems which are inherently consumer choice, right? So you get to choose where you go to have this scan. But you may not have clear visibility around those costs. You may be making choices on things like proximity, which is usually the #1 choice that people use in the US for where they get their service. It's not the quality of the service, is where is it nearer to me so I don't have to catch too many buses, right? Some of the systems are highly triaged. So you don't even get to have that scan until it's been through a process to make sure that it's the right thing for you to do. So there's inherently this kind of dichotomy between transparency and control that exists in this. And certainly the US in particular, I'd say, is a healthcare system that would massively benefit from design thinking, right? You know, when you think about design thinking to drive kind of innovation and better outcomes, you know, a more empathetic approach that looks at the user experience, the patient experiences that go through their health journey. If the health system here was designed in that way, you'd have a very different set of costs and structure to what you have. However, you've got what you've got. Getting to that to something else is incredibly hard because of the fragmentation of funding and structure that you have today. You would have to nationalize the whole thing. You'd have to blow up the entire payer infrastructure. You'd have to do a level of radical change that the American population, frankly, would not take. They just wouldn't politically accept it to drive that change. So instead, what you end up doing is having individual health systems, like the one that Mehdi works for, taking integrated approaches within their own system and trying to fix it for themselves, rather than a national systemic approach.
Eddie, I'm sure you've got a perspective on that.
Oh, I totally agree. And I think, as I said, the complexity, the fragmentation, the regulatory policy aspect of it just drives those types of things that we're seeing today that makes it impossible to create a cohesive system. Having said that, I do see that, like as Glenn said, different entities are trying to drive a lot of that. And, you know, the Kaiser model is very innovative, right? I mean, it's integration, and they're doing some really amazing things in terms of transparency and overall care and so forth. And we're seeing that model play out more and more, you know, in different markets with different hospital systems and insurance, you know. So I think everyone's trying to tackle these challenges through their own means, all with the good intentions of really helping, you know, consumers benefit from the overall health care that's being delivered. So I don't think we're ever going to get to one system. It's just different approaches that will be driven, which is not a bad thing. But I do think ultimately we are going to see more consolidation. That's just going to be the reality to move away from this fragmentation. And when you have fewer players with larger scale, they are going to invest more in technology, transformation, experience, and driving true change. So I see that as the future.
Yeah.
I have and this is actually, John Lohr, thank you for this question. This is a great question from one of our audience members. When we're thinking about allocation of resources, certainly marketing dollars, and we think about big pharma and the billions of dollars they're spending, you know, the ad spends, what are your perspectives on the value that brings to the consumer, the money spent on these ads? And then, of course, just globally, what does this look like? So US versus on a global scale. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to speak about the pharmacy in particular because they have their own business and I'm sure they have their rationale. But generally speaking, you know, healthcare, people, you know, for them, it's about safety and security. It's the bottom layer of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So if you're trying to connect with some purely aspirational storytelling and not really delivering on your promise and your value proposition, I think people will lose trust. Healthcare is about trust. Like Glenn said, if you don't build your brand based on trust, then there's nothing there. So, you know, if you just rely on story and big campaigns from a marketing and focus all your dollars, I think you're wasting a lot of time and money. Again, not thinking specifically about pharma, but in general in healthcare. I truly believe you got to focus on your customers and members. But we're talking at the beginning, you know, the word of mouth is still king. I mean, if you go to a great doctor, and how often do you get recommendations on your healthcare? Not but what you see, but what your friends have to tell you, right? And asking them, do you know a good dentist? Do you know a good doctor? Do you know a good hospital, right? Healthcare in particular, because it's so core to our needs, functional needs, that you have to really satisfy those first before you're trying to spend too much on the emotional side of things through advertising. Not to say advertising is not important, and not to say you spend dollars on it, but you got to balance that. And if I had $10, and I would spend $6, $7 of it on improving the real care, the customer experience side of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Glenn, I'll hear your perspective.
No, I completely agree. It's interesting, isn't it, that the word of mouth thing, by the way, is an interesting one in the sense that it's like just a correlation of this point around people go locally for healthcare. You know, so it's inherently a local services. Word of mouth works less well on certain other types of services. So it's one of those kind of, you know, interesting, what's the right tactic, you know, for your how you address your primary base. But you know, look at on the pharma side, you know, my observation would be that you know, thanks to some well overdue and very appropriate controls and regulation, things like the Sunshine Act, things like anti-kickback statutes and so forth, pharmaceutical companies who are trying to promote their products, are limited in the ways that they can do it now. And so above the line, broad-based advertising is one of their avenues. And for many of these companies, I suspect, I'm not in them, I suspect that when you're in a situation where you've invested very, very, very many millions, hundreds of millions in the development of different pharmaceuticals, throwing another few million on above the line advertising on TV to make sure you get the noise out there is frankly just a smart, marketing play. Now, it's a bit of an alien one for me as a European, I have to say, because, and I'm sure Mehdi shares the same kind of perspective from his career, but you absolutely do not see this kind of thing outside of the US, certainly in most markets. Pharmaceuticals are highly regulated, and most of the world actually are governed by national health systems who have oversight boards who actually control the prescription of those pharmaceuticals. And so there's zero benefit for pharmaceutical companies in promoting their products in that way in Europe or most of the markets, because consumers don't have that choice. And frankly, doctors don't listen to consumers when it comes to this kind of stuff. So I suspect that the pharmaceutical companies in the US would not be doing it unless it was effective. It's certainly, in the scheme of their overall spend, relatively low numbers. And it still seems to be their primary avenue to get their message out there, particularly given the controls that have been put in place on regulation. That would be my perspective, at least.
That's great. No, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, fascinating. I got there was a connection between kickbacks going away and advertising going up, which is an interesting transition in my world. And I agree with the original point of the experience, and where you're going to actually spend is on the experience wherever possible, which makes total sense to me. So a question about, like, are there brands out there that you see that have done it well during this pandemic? And do you think that's changed as you've seen this happen? Are there brands that have been more successful or less successful during this time period broadly in getting through this? I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, the brands that I'm drawn to during this times are the ones that have led with action rather than just sentiment, right? Really trying to unite efforts to help governments, whether it's healthcare professionals, during this really unprecedented time. I think like companies like Microsoft, who kind of provided their cloud services to nonprofits for free, right? And donated $35 million, or Comcast, who provided their Wi-Fi free to all users, or even, luxury brands. I think Louis Vuitton was the first company to repurpose their perfume factories for hand sanitizers. So I think, during this time, I'm really drawn to those types of brands. In Unilever, driving hygiene awareness in the poorest countries around the world, and donating, millions and millions of free products. To me, companies and brands need to, demonstrate their actions, not just their words, especially during these times. So to me, those that truly embrace their purpose, not just, again, through telling people that is their purpose, but showing it that that's what they lead with, I think are the ones that ultimately will get the recognition and the trust that Glenn talked about at the beginning.
Yeah, I agree. It's I think there's a couple of things, isn't there? One is the bigger macro brand trust and reputation, and then what you just experience yourself. And so you see some big companies doing smart things. CVS and Walgreens, Walmart. They've done some smart stuff, and they've combined doing things that truly help people in the current situation, but also doing things that truly help their employees going through these situations, and that matters to a lot of people. Starbucks is another interesting one. I'm not a Starbucks fan, but I'm more inclined to go to Starbucks when you look at things that they've been doing, right? they partnered with Arizona State University to do kind of like free educational programs for their employees. They kind of bumped up their 401ks for their people. They paid for their tuition, and they did and all sorts of things, as well as COVID related. But also, I'd say COVID has done two things. One is that it's kind of raised people's awareness of inequality in society. People have seen the negative impact that more disadvantaged people of society have as a result of this stuff. And then when coupled with some of the awful things that have been going on, that's re-energized the Black Lives Movement area, you've seen brands reacting to both of those things. And you see, well, which ones are actually stepping up in a way that is both resonant with your own values, but also when you yourself have a brother or a sister or someone who's lost their job, who's been furloughed, who's been, so there's these kind of combination of societal reactions and individual impacts that all of us are getting day in, day out. But so the brands that, I think the biggest brand that I have admired the most is probably the New Zealand government. And it certainly made me want to go and look for their immigration strategy here and say, okay, so New Zealand, that looks like a pretty good place, right? It looks like it's quite well run. Let's go over there.
Mm-hmm. That's a great answer. Love that. So that brings up another, someone else, or Alan asked the question of, are we embracing healthcare or health as a movement like BLM or climate change, right? This is an important movement that companies need to consider, that it's an integral part of our society. Is it elevated to that level, do you think? You've almost touched on that, Glenn. Mehdi?
Yeah, I hope so. The two foundation of any healthy society is their healthcare and educational system, right? Those are pillars. If you don't have a healthy country and an educated, then it leaves you behind, right? As a society. So it is great to see that there's more discussions around healthcare and the future of healthcare. We need to have those dialogue. We need to help really come up with better ideas for the future. We need to get more people. One of the reasons I joined healthcare, as you mentioned, Aaron, and my background was not in healthcare, but I saw an opportunity to make a difference, to come in, again, not as a marketer per se, but someone that really understood design thinking, understood innovation, understood how to really connect with people and satisfy their needs in much more innovative, effective ways. That was the impetus for me joining the healthcare, right? And I want more people to join it. There's so much opportunity to really move the needle in healthcare and really make a difference in people's lives at the end of the day. And so I think we need to have those dialogues. We need to attract better talent, but also we need organizations to be open to it, to new ideas. I think in healthcare, it's still a lot of the thinking is kind of based on perhaps previous sort of ways of approach to things, right? But we need to embrace new thinking, design thinking, innovation, customer centricity, all those things. And that's in a skill that may not be inherent in a lot of the organizations, and you have to bring that into the organization and allow it to kind of develop. It's interesting, one of the things that you talked about is this notion of cognitive diversity, right? Well, if any industry needs it, it's healthcare, right? And that sort of diversity in thinking, diversity of skills, diversity of backgrounds, all those things are critical in the healthcare in terms of inclusion, but also collaboration. Mm-hmm. But what's also important is having the expertise to do it and adopt it from a cultural perspective. One of the challenges that you see is people try to embrace that, and I've seen that in healthcare. So you go from inclusion, collaboration, but it's not necessarily practiced effectively. So you get this unwanted third element that creeps in, which is consensus. And we know consensus is, it's not good for innovation, right? It goes against everything about innovation. So, and I've seen that happen in healthcare where, yeah, we're collaborating, but it's like, no, we have to make a decision that we all agree, and that's not really what collaboration is about. So it's really about really bringing a lot of that cognitive diversity and skills and practices into healthcare. And I think if we do that, then I think we will drive a better healthcare system for everyone.
Fantastic.
Yeah, just to chip in on it, it's one of those things, isn't it, that what you really hope is that a pandemic of this sort, which was widely predicted, yet still seemed to arrive as a surprise to health systems around the world, that this should, could, and must act as an imperative for change for healthcare systems and for governments who oversee them. And when you look at the current way that in many societies healthcare has been treated under a capitalist model, which inherently leads you towards optimizing costs and structures for the things that you have today to be the most efficient, doesn't always work very well in a situation like this. And I really sincerely hope that some of those lessons are learned. That'd be the one point, and that governments and institutions systemize, if you will, capacity and understanding that comes from this. The impact it has, not just only on infrastructure, things like intensive care facilities, but the impact it has on healthcare professionals as well. And then lastly, I'd say that the other imperative for change, which actually does worry me, is clearly what this has exposed is the interconnectivity of not just the health system within a country, but globally, right? Mm-hmm. There's the simple fact of the spread of viruses across multiple jurisdictions, irrespective of their health system, just shows how fragile the system is today. And at the risk of sounding political, I think a government stepping back from bodies like the WHO, I find deeply concerning, rather than trying to actually invest to fix those institutions or put in place better institutions. I'm not pro or anti any one thing, but the point is more, when you go through something like this, you should be actively engaged in solving the problem, not isolating yourself from the rest of the world. So I just hope that what you can do here, or what we can see here, is an elevation in the discussion of the importance of healthcare as a global opportunity and challenge, and not one that needs to be driven mindlessly by the bottom dollar or any one point. There's a place for that. You need efficiency and effectiveness, but you also need to make sure you take care of your population and you take care of your healthcare professionals.
Brilliant. Empathy, critical right now, for sure. Thank you both. I'm going to switch gears to a final question for both of you that I didn't give in advance, but we've been asking our speakers of late. Favorite book or book that you've recently read that you'd recommend to our audience? From any industry, from any fiction, nonfiction, any thoughts to share?
I'm not exactly sure the title of it, but it's a book focused on AI and the future of AI and what role that plays. And I'm fascinated by that as it pertains to its potential for healthcare. I think there's many opportunities of how technology can impact healthcare, whether it's from wearables, whether it's, we're seeing now, ultra scans that you can take home with you, where if you're pregnant, you can do your own scan at home and without having to visit physicians. So there's so much in terms of technology advancements, whether it's AI and machine learning, and that can really impact the healthcare. So I'm sort of fascinated with the opportunities around that.
Thanks, Mehdi.
I'll give you two businessy ones. One book that just came out by Keith Ferrazzi called Leading Without Authority. So for those of you who operate in large environments, it's very helpful, but also frankly, for those of you who you are trying to influence people in complex business environments, it's a very nice book that sets out how you can be successful and be successful in your organization by co-elevating the people around you. It's a very nice concept. Some of the writing, I hope Keith's not watching. I hope it's a little bit hokey, but the content is extremely strong. And the second one I'd recommend, and this is almost a little bit of a plug for someone you've got speaking coming up. We were talking about word of mouth, but Ted Wright's book, Fizz, on word of mouth marketing is excellent. So that's a really fun book, great read, very insightful. So you'd enjoy that one.
Ted's going to love that you said that, Glenn. We'll let him know that you you pointed us in that direction. And you said that original, because we have our audience asking, was Leading Without Authority was the first book that you mentioned?
Yeah, Leading Without Authority by Keith Ferrazzi, and Ed Wright's book, Fizz. Great books.
Perfect. Thank you both. Fantastic.
Yes, wonderful. Well, you have spent another hour with us on a Thursday. And I thank all of you as guests to come hang out with us, and also Glenn and Mehdi, and the wonderful inspirational conversation you have provided for our audience. This is absolutely amazing, wonderful. I want to make sure not only does Ted get a plug for the future, the fact that he's going to be on this stage coming up in a month, I believe, Kelly, or maybe a month as he's coming up. Our next one, which you'll see an invite on soon, is going to be Chocolate and Coffee, a chocolate that some of you might know about because we've been pushing it out to the world. A nice healthy habit chocolate called Verse Chocolate is coming up, along with our local Peace Coffee here in the Twin Cities, because coffee and chocolate go together very nicely. If you have would like to receive an invite to this in the future, make sure you go to capsule.us and sign up to I want to be a part of this in the future, so you make sure you get an invite. And again, thank you everyone for showing up, and to our guests, thank you. Wonderful inspiration.
Well, thank you, Kelly and Aaron, for the opportunity, and Glenn, always great speaking with you.
Likewise, brother. Great to see you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you both.
All right. Thank you all. Thanks.